Welcome to the Stationary Bandit, a show about legal history and state formation. As always, today's interview does not reflect the views of the employers of either my guests or myself. Well, I'm talking today with Kevin Vallier, professor at the University of Toledo, author of many books, most recently, All the Kingdoms of the World, on radical religious alternatives to liberalism. That's the title of it, right? Okay, great. I just had it in my memory, so I wanted to make sure. So I want to start a little bit with your intellectual history, because I know a fair amount about it, but there's just details I want still. So the first is just kind of how did you get into libertarianism specifically originally?
Yeah, well, it's a fun story. I grew up in South Alabama, and when I sort of came to political awareness, I was a kind of fierce Democrat atheist, surrounded by kind of like moral majority Republicans in the late '90s. And my friends were creationists, and I thought that was dumb. And the Columbine shooting had happened, and we were forced to wear public school uniforms. And I just felt just kind of like stultified and tied down and all this stuff. And when I got to college at WashU, I started working with the College Democrats on the Gore campaign. Very embarrassing now. But and I was like, oh, we're going to talk about ideas. It's going to be awesome. And they didn't want to do that. They wanted to climb the ladder and hang out with Bill Bradley and stuff in the campaign.
Hmm.
But there were these like weird conservative and libertarians that really wanted to talk. One of whom was Dan McCarthy, incidentally, who's well known in conservative circles these days. He was a grad student at WashU in
Yeah,
classics at the time.
cool.
And they pulled me away, and they started giving me books and talking to me about ideas. And one of those books was Murray Rothbard's For New Liberty. And that was the first work of political philosophy I read front to back, and I converted, and I became an anarcho-capitalist, and I was a hardcore Rothbardian for several years. So much so that I helped to organize the WashU College of Libertarians, and we used to take people in large trips down to the Mises Institute, driving from St. Louis to Auburn for God knows why.
Right on.
Um, so that's how I found libertarianism in its hardest core, purest form.
Right.
And I drank deeply from that well.
So were you, as an anarcho-capitalist, were you always like a Rothbard guy, or did you ever have a anarcho-capitalist period that wasn't Rothbard particularly?
I was always a natural rights guy, and so I never went for the kind of like morally vaguer sort of David Friedman stuff.
Right.
And I gradually got walked down that path away from what we would think of as Rothbardianism by two intellectuals I met at the Mises Institute, one of whom was Roderick Long, who sort of pushed me in a more left-wing virtue ethicist direction while
Right.
still being natural rights, and Ed Feser,
Right.
who was a libertarian then, who pushed me more in a Thomistic virtue, natural rights, before he abandoned natural rights.
Right.
Um, and so it was weird to have these two very smart philosophers who sharply disagreed with each other on many things, both kind of convincing me of things at the same time.
Right.
Um,
And they were both going to
uh,
Mises stuff?
yes, 2002, and
Okay.
I met Fazer and Long in 2002 at the
Okay.
Mises Institute. Yeah, and I talked to them a lot and hung out with them both a lot. They were my formative intellectual influences until I met the great Gauss.
Right.
So, yeah.
So, where as an anarcho-capitalist, because I've never really known the Rothbard world. I've got a lot of friends who've been into it, but the
Yeah,
only introductions I've had into the literature are the very different world of Friedman stuff and Brian
yeah,
Kaplan stuff.
yeah,
And both of them are very into, the literature on stateless legal systems, because that is kind
yes,
of the thing that people throw at you.
yeah,
Like, do Rothbard people talk about
yes.
that all the time? Did
They
you
do.
spend a
They
lot of time
love to
thinking
talk.
about
Yeah,
that?
I did. I mean, it's not like they hate David Friedman at all.
Right.
It's just that they're just such hardcore deontologists and they just hate utilitarianism so passionately that they don't like to get like too far into it because they always want to stress that this is like the entailment of a priori moral principles or whatever.
Right.
And they're a real mush when it comes to that stuff because Rothbard says he's a Thomist. And then he gives this like weird, like Habermasian presuppositionalist argument for his principles, which isn't Thomistic at all.
Hmm.
And it comes like from Habermas and Appel via Hoppe. And, that's because before Hoppe went deep racist. And so like all of the influences there were super weird. Like it was It's like the moderate was Walter Block,
Right.
because Roderick was the left and Hoppe was the right. But that was before, so there's all this spectrum of opinion here. And Roderick got along with David very well. And so it was the Roderick piece where you really got a lot of the David Friedman coming through.
Right. And
And all the stateless legal order stuff, just talking a lot about it. But the Hoppians liked it too. They didn't dislike it. They just
right.
wanted to do their churning it out from a priori principles. Not that Roderick minded a priorism. I mean, that was his favorite stuff of Hoppe's actually.
Right.
Was the that anyway? Everyone was interested back then in a priorism. I say everyone was super into it.
Right. Well, so that's another question I had on your timeline is did you kind of go straight from Rothbard to Gauss as the kind of like
It's a very strange thing.
okay.
Um, yes, in a way. I mean, it's the question. The thing that was the break for me was I was listening to Walter Block give this lecture, and he was talking about locking up Rosie O'Donnell for being for gun control.
Hmm. Right.
Sorry,
Right.
sorry, this Walter. Um, um, and I thought something's wrong with that. Like, even if libertarianism is true, she doesn't think that it is.
Right.
And I didn't really quite know how to make sense of that. And then Phaser, in his attempts to move away from Rothbard, was like, well, there are these preconditions on self ownership. They include virtue, the right virtues. And I thought that's kind of building in like all your moral judgment into libertarianism. And one of the cool things was it was supposed to be like kind of neutral about that stuff.
Right.
So it was between watching Phaser go anti-libertarian and Walter go like hardcore, like authoritarian libertarian, and then seeing like the Hopper racism stuff. And it's like all kind of weirdly trended in this like fist poundy direction.
Right.
And Jerry really helped me to see that like there was something odd about that. And there was something odd, like kind of like built into moral reasoning about that, which was that you don't kind of like you try not to control people just when they're non-culpably mistaken about things,
Hmm.
you know. And I mean, even if you're correct and they're incorrect, there's some kind of intervening meta norm that says, look, when we disagree about norms, here are the norms that we should use to resolve them. And so I decided I'd be the only libertarian working on theories about how we understand the morality that we can inhabit with non-libertarians.
Right.
And that's how I got into public reason.
Right.
It was not ever really the Rawlsian version. I was never a Rawlsian.
Right.
Um, Jerry said, be a libertarian all day, but try not to browbeat the non-libertarians.
Hmm.
And then let's think about what a social order would be like, where you can do some libertarian stuff, but you can cooperate with people that aren't libertarians, and you can respect them, and you can be friends with them, and get along with them, and not be threatened by them. And ultimately, and didn't always put it this way, but I later would, to build trust with them.
Right.
Um,
So
so
this is a question I have about that transition is it feels like there's a one of the big shifts is in the kind of social ontology that those two groups talk
yeah.
with. And I'm curious like if you could talk about your history with that because that's something that I'm still trying to even figure out the language for in my own thinking. And so like how did that shift work for you of just like going like that's just a completely different kind of metaphysics, right?
Oh, you mean, but no. So I mean, what with the whole attempt of the Public Reason Project is to try to be metaphysically neutral. Now, I mean, you
Right.
can't. But Jerry tried, and I think he was much better at it than the Rawlsians, even if it's hopeless in the end. A
Hmm.
real go can be made of it. Because the thought was that we could make sense of our justification of interpersonal moral claims somewhat, but not entirely independently of our metaphysical disagreements.
Right.
And so Jerry wasn't saying change your metaphysics. In fact, he was saying, like, let me show you why you don't need to change your metaphysics to do political philosophy.
Hmm.
This is something else Rawls thought. This is why I get so irritated when everyone says that, politics always presupposes a single philosophical anthropology. I'm perfectly fine with the claim that it provides like it brackets a set of anthropologies,
Right.
right? Like that's true, right? But the idea that it presupposes one
Right.
has always seemed to me like absurd. It's like really hard to show that that's true. But I don't think people distinguish between whether, say, liberalism presupposes they're right to see there's a set presupposed, but they're wrong to think it's a singleton,
Hmm.
right? And I mean, Rawls and Jerry both understood that liberalism presupposed a set of doctrines. There were some things that were out and some things that were in.
Right.
The question is how big the set can be, and Jerry's very keen to show that it was quite big.
Hmm.
Um, and so that's what one of the things that's always irritated me in the post liberals is like they always everyone always understood the set of reasonable doctrines was bounded.
Right.
Right? The question is what the bounds were and whether there was any virtue in going for a big set. And
Hmm.
the answer is there's a very big virtue. And that's why I wrote the trust books to say that virtues of a big set is get a lot of trust.
Yeah.
And trust is all this can do all this really cool stuff.
So, I mean, what's the ontology of just the kind of basic concepts of, order, society,
Oh, you
state?
mean like what are the relevant not what the person is. You mean like
Yes.
all the other stuff too.
Yes. All the other stuff.
Oh,
Yeah. Yeah.
okay. So I mean each one would take time.
Right.
But with respect to stability, I mean, it depends on what you want to stabilize, right? So at least within the Rawlsian or Gaussian system, what you're trying to stabilize is pluralism
Hmm.
and the rules that make pluralism possible. Whereas, say, an integralist picture, you're trying to stabilize the moral truth, right? You're trying to keep everyone organized around it. Um, and so stability is always some kind of like functional equilibrium process,
Right.
right? Now, there's another dimension, which is the relationship between the interhuman and the human divine orders. Um, and those are more like one conforming to God's law and two conforming to God's will within that law. So God's positive law within the natural law. And that question turns out to be very interesting. And I thought a great deal about it in my 20s and 30s. And I have a couple of essays now trying to put it together. But after I do the fusionism book, I'll turn to it.
Hmm.
But who wants to know my Sanders Prize essay, Trinitarian Contractarianism's out there. And
What's that? What
yeah.
year's that from?
It's not quite out yet,
Oh,
actually.
oh,
It
it's
was
not out.
accepted.
Okay.
I won the prize in 23, but I
Okay.
presented the paper first in 2015.
Okay.
And I came up with the idea in 2008 or 9. But it took time to put it together because to do Christian theology and contractarian moral theory at the same time, nobody likes that.
Right.
And so we just decided to do it after tenure. But the rough idea here was the contractarian based order has a lot to recommend it because it's persons uniting under a common will. And then that's a participation in the Trinity. It's not the only way for a society to be good, but it is a way for a society to be good. And I thought that was interesting and cool. If you're trying to imitate the form of the good, and the form of the good is a community, well, so that will be part of my sort of argumentative edifice, which I
Right.
think will offer my theological reconciliation of how a Christian can be a classical liberal, which is, in a certain sense, the only question I've ever been interested in,
Right.
ever since I ended up down at the Mises Institute and converted back to Christianity when I was 19.
Right. So I wanna ask some questions about the church history, or the political and church history in all the kingdoms, because that is, I didn't really, I had heard you give some interviews about this book, and I didn't really realize how much was in there. That second chapter, I mean, that itself is, I think, worth the price of admission. I mean, there's a lot of individual chapters in that book that I
I
think are worth
worked
the price of
so
admission.
hard on that chapter.
Yeah, I remember seeing you tweeting
Yeah,
about it, about all the
yeah,
books you were
yeah,
reading at the time,
yeah,
and I still have a lot of them on my Amazon wish list because I was like, oh,
yeah,
those all sound like good
yeah,
books. But no,
yeah,
I mean, it's a great single resource, and like some just basic questions I've still got
yeah.
about that is,
Yeah, let
and
me give
this,
people a little bit of background for
yeah,
this. So,
thank you.
one of the things that happened after I stopped working on the public reason stuff was winding down. I've been working on trust a lot. It had been turning into some empirical work. Um, And around 2020, Oxford was like, oh, this integralism thing seems to be going somewhere. Let's have someone do the book. And my friend Jacob Levy was like, hey, should I Kevin do the book? And so they invited me to do the book. I'd done some blogging on it. I've been watching it because Kaiser went proto-integralist or integralist or whatever around 2003 or four. And it was all like, what matters is the truth and the good and all this stuff. And I kind of thought, well, something's gone awry. And then Jerry helped me to kind of make sense of it. But I shelved actually writing on it. Um, and then Oxford invited me to do it. I'm like, okay, I'm going to do it. I want to engage the new right. I want to try to understand what's going on. And so I studied Catholic integralism because I was following these nutcases on Twitter.
Hmm.
And I was also interacting with Tom Pink because I had heard of Pink, as I talk in chapter one, in graduate
Right.
school, because he had edited the new edition of Suarez's God and Law, on Law and God the Lawgiver. And so um, watching the debates about Dignitatis Humanae and all this stuff, and I got super into it because I decided to leave Protestantism.
Hmm.
And I was trying to decide whether to become Catholic or Orthodox. And so that was another big piece of this that got me into integralism because I was reading all the church history and discernment. Um, and so I was like, oh, okay, I'm like doing all of these things. And so I decided, oh, I'm going to get into like this view and like really figure out what I think's wrong with it. And in many ways, and I think my old teacher Ed Fazer figured this out. It was me grappling with why he was wrong.
Hmm.
Which I think is why he reviewed the book the way that he did. Because I was trying to work out in some detail what I thought the internal problems were, right? So it wasn't just like, oh, classical liberalism is true. Like that wasn't the point of the book. The
Right.
point was to get in the guts and make the very best case for it and the very best case against it, and just really figure out for myself like what's wrong with it. And so what I decided to do early in the book is I'm like just going to give like the two very best arguments I know for this, and I'm just going to work my butt off to give it. And I'm going to do a better. Sorry, I mean this is arrogant in a way, but it's like I'm going to do a better job than those guys have ever done. Like I'm just like I'm going to do like these like are going to be like really really good work. Also, because I want all the anti-integralists to be like, uh-oh, this is a serious view. We better take it seriously. Because if there's any intellectually serious view on the new right,
Right.
it's integralism.
Yeah.
It's not Yarvin. It's not Bat. It's
Yeah.
not even Yoram. I mean, I like Yoram. Okay, like don't get me wrong.
Right.
Okay, it's not the Christian nationalists. Right, like most of these guys are jokers.
Yeah.
But the integralists, they can claim like Suarez and Aquinas. Probably, I get in trouble with this with my Whig Thomist friends. But like, come on, like, let's just be honest. Like, this was not a classical liberal.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so all those Salamancans, the Austrians love to talk about, they were heretic burners.
Hmm.
They were defenders of it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the School of Salamanca, yeah, they got prices and they didn't get religious liberties. And I was never told that. So, um, the church history chapter arose as my attempt to make the very best case for the integralist read church history, and particularly the teaching about the relationship of church and state in church history.
Right.
Um, and as I see it, the story, and this is a very orthodox perspective, but this is kind of my take. Um, we have a united church, roughly, at least in the top of the Mediterranean,
Right.
bottom, it's a different story somewhat. But you've got the Greek half of the empire, the Latin half, right? And the Greeks are kind of weird compared to the Latins because the Greeks have all of these apostolic sees, that is, churches that were founded by the apostles. But they have one ruler. And after the fall of the Roman Empire, you have one see, a double see, Peter and Paul's see in Rome. And you have many rulers. And lo and behold, the two sides decide to theorize their view as the proper and holy one. The one with a holy emperor, the church doesn't have its own political sovereignty over the emperor. The emperor can do things like call the first seven ecumenical councils, although, to be fair, the seventh was called by the regent empress Irene.
Right.
Um, and and then the popes were like, well, they start to take over the apparatus of the Roman Empire. They start providing legal services and medical services and all this kind of stuff. And then they start to think, okay, man, maybe something's sort of good about this. Not, yeah, it's good if we're in charge. No, but like, well, it's a cause for reflection. And they say, you know what? I mean, spiritual things are higher than temporal things. It's clear that God established the kings, has God established the state. Okay, so we don't get to do what the church can't do whatever it wants, but the church should be able to guide and help the state in order to help the salvation of the king's subjects, at least the baptized ones. And so the thought was that the church would have a kind of indirect sovereignty over the state, which it functionally did in many regions for quite some time. And this theory was not very well developed in the early Middle Ages, but in the High Middle Ages, it became developed to a pretty high degree, particularly as more of Europe organized and was Christianized, and so the Pope's power and authority expanded even without the crown expanding very much outside of the Franks,
Right.
who did push back, and that was just a harbinger of what was to come. States consolidated, and they told the Pope, "Hell no,"
Right.
more and more. Um, and so, essentially, the dominant political theology in Rome for 1,000 years was something like integralism, and we can't deny it.
Right.
They had a theory about what the best church state relations were. It was entirely reasonable given the position that they were in. And I will also say this: the papacy did a lot of good in the medieval period. The church kept a lot of things going, and it provided a lot of stability at a time where geography and technology made larger, more functional states impossible.
So
Um,
that's something I was kind of curious about in this whole
yeah,
narrative is how clear at that point. I mean, is it a bit of a, backward looking reconstruction to really clearly make it kind of like the church and the state as a kind of dual
the
sovereignty
diarchy.
in the sense, yeah, exactly. Or is it even messier than that? Because like when you're talking about law, on the ground, like you don't just have church courts and the king's courts. Like in a lot of these places, you have
No,
like all
there's
sorts
law
of lords.
everywhere.
Exactly, you have
The
lords
Germans have it. Your
towns.
law goes with the people. It's not located in geography. No, there's a
Exactly. So
tremendous amount of legal pluralism. Sovereignty was more of a theory than a reality at that time,
okay, well, and that's something I was curious about is how
but it was part of the
theorized is
theory.
it? It is part of the theory.
I think so.
Okay,
I think in integralism, there is a theory of the state. There are people like Andrew Willard Jones who would disagree.
right.
But of all the many things I could say about Adrian Brumule, I will say this. His discussion of Andrew Willard Jones and was correct in saying that essentially Jones's view of sovereignty is to hide the ball.
Right. Well, so
Um, so,
is
so, so I think it is true in much of the medieval period that sovereignty seems like it's by pact and person to person.
right.
And it's true that sovereignty is distributed.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm not trying to be a Schmittian and saying, oh, it's always located somewhere, even
Sure.
if you don't say, right? It can be
Sure.
distributed. That's not a problem,
Right.
right? But the theory of the state is different than the reality of the state. And I do think, like even going, this is an inheritance of the ancient world, but also the Roman Empire. They believe there are states, even if there really aren't.
Right. So that makes sense, and that was
Yeah.
kind of what I was wondering. Is like, does it feel like it's just an inheritance of a Rome at that point? Like it's just a
Yes.
memory of like there is still kind of a centralized legal
Yes,
concept
because they
of the
can't,
state.
they don't understand. It's really hard to understand spontaneous order, right? Like it's a very counterintuitive concept. And the fact that all these medievals are like looking at the world and kind of categorizing it in terms of states, that's not any more surprising in a way than they're seeing, four elements,
Right.
right? Or
Right.
spheres or
Right.
ether or whatever, right? They just don't have the categories because they don't have the science.
Yeah.
And that's okay. They're just mistaken.
Yeah.
But now there are states.
Right. Well, so
And so,
and something I was curious about is, again, following up on that, is in the transition from like the high Middle Ages to the early modern period, in my kind of
yeah,
naive understanding of that intellectual history, it does feel like there's a shift to a kind of obsession with the need for the uniformity of the state
yes,
and a
yes,
concern over
yeah,
splitting up the state. And I guess that's
yes,
something that I've found a little puzzling of like, why are they worried about it at the time where it kind of becomes a reality of like you have these centralized states? Why are all these theorists worried about it as like this is a practical reality? Is it because civil war is more possible
yes.
and
War,
costly?
war, conflict. It becomes clear, I think, that you could have less.
Right.
And there'd been a lot, like particularly with respect to like the wars of religion. And of course, we can talk about whether they're of religion or not, but all the
Right.
same, they were devastating.
Right.
I mean, massive depopulation in many cases of Germany. So a lot of people are thinking like, well, and this is an occasion for reflection with Hobbes and Locke with all the religious conflict in England, right? So, the Reformation is a thought. It does have this thought that like, okay, well, I mean, we want to have not all this fighting after we have a whole bunch of it because the Lutherans and the Calvinists, or everyone thinks everyone's going to come to agree with them, and they don't. Um, and they have to throw in with kings.
Right.
And on the continent anyway, of course, in England and America, it was quite different because the Calvinists were a little different then
Hmm.
there, pretty different. Um, and so the thought was, well, um, Europe is not going to return to religious uniformity. There's going to be conflict, and so we just have to kind of smash it.
Right.
And there was a belief that you could not have religious pluralism. You
Right.
could have it between states. That's the Westphalian Peace. It's the recognition that that's possible, right? But they kind of knew that because you could live next to a Muslim state. It wasn't that stable, but it could be done, right? So, and they knew enough history to know that there were differences and people got along. But within Christendom, the thought was, okay, well, we're gonna get to agreement, and then you realize you aren't, and then that becomes cause for reflection. It's that line of reasoning, I think, 100 years later leads to liberalism as a set of social technologies, which
Right.
I see as evolving before liberals themselves start to reflect and to
Right.
say, ah, yes, liberalism.
Well, and this is taking us out a little bit farther in the,
Yeah,
historically and geographically. But I've been reading a little bit about, the origins of federalism. I'm going
yeah,
to be talking to one of my old law school profs, Alison LaCroix, a historian, about this, and she talks about how much, the founding generation, the intellectuals, were really concerned about this idea of splitting sovereignty, and that
yes,
is something where at that
yep.
point, what are they concerned is going to happen? Like, what is the thing where the
The
world
concern is they're going to
ends?
have sovereignties too concentrated or it's too distributed.
And what's the problem with
If there's
distributed, though?
distributed, it's going to be conflict,
Okay.
but also the inability to solve large coordination problems like common defense
Right.
and to secure common trade barriers or to
Hmm.
reduce trade barriers and so on. It's really good to be able to have federations. And the thought would be is if you could develop a theory of divided sovereignty and design it so it could stick, that you could have the best of both worlds. I mean, it's very much the founder's attitude is we know enough about history and science
Right.
that we can design a constitution that can capture the best benefits of horizontal and vertical separation of powers and all at once.
Right.
It was I mean, being teaching a lot of American political history now, they really were so ambitious in such a beautiful way.
Right.
I mean, they really thought they could really improve lives. And you know what? They were not entirely wrong.
Hmm.
But to think you could design a constitution that would capture the benefits of horizontal and vertical distribution of power simultaneously, and to carry out at a young age, younger than we are now in many cases,
Right.
a rich and intense debate about how exactly to do that. I mean, you just have to be kind of impressed by that. Like, how can you
Right.
not be impressed by
Oh
that?
yeah. No, it's crazy.
So, yeah, I know. So,
Yeah. Rewinding, 500 years in the past, when we're talking way more fractured polities here again, when the church is theorizing, and when the idea of sovereignty is the idea of sovereignty and secular authority, like how much are those the same thing? Or when you're talking about secular authority, you really are
divine
picturing like we're
sovereignty
talking
is the
about
way people
lords,
are thinking about
towns,
this.
whatever. Okay.
Now, divine sovereignty is the origin of a lot of this thinking. I mean, that's everywhere in human history. Once you get past ancestor worship, right? Like the king is a god, or their family is a god, or they're sons of the gods, or they're authorized by the gods, or they have the mandate of heaven,
Hmm.
or whatever. Everywhere you've got sacred monarchy,
Right.
right? The authority comes from the divine in some way. That is not a Christian idea, specifically Christian idea. It's not even specific to any one religion.
Right.
So the idea that sovereignty comes, there's some sort of divine ordering principle. That's where I see the ideas coming from, and it's the dominant form of legitimization. Once there need to be theories of legitimization, once you get beyond hunter gatherer,
Right.
it doesn't really have to arise, and so you basically just get ancestor worship. But once you have large groups where you need someone to suppress everyone else in order to get them to organize, like having a pharaoh or like a Hawaiian dictator.
Right.
People that was apparently pretty miserable long periods of time. You couldn't get away. So,
Right.
there had to be a rationale.
Hmm.
And I'm not trying to say religion's made up. I believe in Jesus,
Right.
but I am saying many religions were made up,
Right.
and like almost all of them.
Yeah.
And so they did serve a power legitimizing function. Of course, the faith has been used to do that.
Right.
Um, so, a lot of what's going on with divine sovereignty, I think, really does, and I'll sound like pretty anarchist here, but that's okay, which is that, yeah, a lot of it's made up in order to control people.
Right.
Look, I mean, like a lot of religion is made up to control people. Like, why we can say this
Hmm.
as Christians,
Hmm.
right? And so divine sovereignty is, I think, not divine sovereignty, but the idea of a religion as a legitimating principle is like there's an intuition there that's true. I think God does add his yes to our yes when we consent to a government.
Hmm.
But for the most part, it's problematic. But so I see modern sovereignty is originating in the gift from divine sovereignty. And so, that's how I think about it.
Right.
So,
So,
but I mean, it's not always illegitimate. I'm just saying most of the time it's abused. Just like as much as I love the social contract, most of the time social contract language is abused.
right. So, in terms of history of this development here of the collapsing of the secular, or not collapsing, the coalescing the secular order into kind of a unified sovereignty, I've been curious because I know you follow the Henrik and Schultz, etc.
Yeah.
arguments there. Like, how important do you think that the church's war against kinship groups was for the creation
I don't know
of
about
the
just,
state
I mean, I
specifically?
don't know enough to dispute the view, except that it just seems really plausible. And
Hmm.
the last time I talked to him about it, he was looking into the Greek histories, the baptismal histories. It
Hmm.
just in the Russian ones, he had to have a lot of it translated to
Right.
see if it held in the East.
Right.
And if it held in the East, then I was going to, be more on board.
Right.
Um, but a lot of modern cooperation, my trust buddies, my Scandinavian economist friends, they point out of cooperation, expansive cooperation developing in maritime ports all over the world as potential counterexamples.
Hmm.
But I haven't looked into those cases. Um, but whenever this is the reason I got into the work with Christina Bicchieri on trust, which is, I always like to begin my talks. It's like at some point humans learn to trust strangers with their lives.
Right.
We didn't do that most of the time, right? But
Right.
now we eat cereal and we don't know who made it, and we don't know who helped make the box and who made the plastic, and they don't know each other. And we eat it and we walk down the street and we're not worried that someone's going to shoot us. Kind of incredible, really. I can drive anywhere in the country and not really worried about people not letting me cut into traffic.
Hmm.
So how do we do that? And Henrik has a story where you kind of had to. It became adaptive because you didn't have kinship networks.
Right.
Now, Christina and I am trying to tell the micro psychological story. How does it happen in here?
Hmm.
Right? Not just like why was it adaptive at the group level? Joe's not really got that piece of the story. Not that he's trying to give it. What I see him as doing is like setting out like conditions, at least sufficient conditions, for when modern mindsets and weird minds would evolve. And weirds are very, very good at social trust. This is one thing I get left out of the Dean stories. Like the weirds are kind of bad at family.
Right.
Like they are kind of atomized and miserable. Like that's true. But
Right.
they're way better with strangers. They're just like so much better with strangers. Like progressives, like they're really good with strangers. They get divorced a bunch, but they're really good with strangers. There's trade-offs,
Right.
you know, and Pat just can't see it,
Right.
and so he just sees the downside. And liberalism, yeah, you sacrifice some clannishness. Now, clannishness, it's not always good
Right.
because some clans are bad. So I
Right.
don't want to say clans are always good. We do have more individualism than is optimal from a Christian perspective, but there are societies that have too little.
Right.
And, Fukuyama points out in his trust book, he's like, you think Americans are individualistic, but boy, do they like to form groups more than anybody else. And
Hmm.
that's just Tocqueville, right? So the thought is like, okay, but so if you have a society, and you get a lot of social trust and you get voluntary groupishness, Like it's pretty, like it's like that's pretty good, really. There are some sacrifices, right? Because you don't come up with a sacred canopy, right? Exit's an option, and the fact that exit's an option means that you pay a price,
Right.
and that price is you get weakening of community because you can imagine not being in it.
Right.
That's a price.
So here's
So,
when.
Hendrick is right to say you get this individualization, and then you get more social capital in modern institutions, and lots of cool stuff happens. And that's a story that, Deneen could glom onto and be like, see, I don't know if he wants to say it's the Catholic Church's fault. All the same.
Right. Well, so on the just basic question about the trust stuff that I'm still a little thin on is
Yep.
I understand trust on the level of like I'm not going to get killed or even like I could make
Yep.
basic exchanges with people.
Yep.
But in your, in trust in a polarized, is it polarized age or polarized
Yep.
world? Sorry, yeah,
Yeah.
age. Okay,
Age.
trust in
Yep.
polarized age. Another great book of yours. Listeners should go check it out. You talk about the basics of trust being that someone will abide by a kind of like communal minimal morality. And at times it sounds like that's
From moral grounds.
okay, right,
So the people are following the rules because they have some amount of moral concern, right? Because
right,
a sociopath could be a perfect rule observer,
right,
but you wouldn't trust them because as soon as they can get away with it, they'll get you.
right,
But if someone has a moral commitment, that's a kind of stability.
right,
And you could think, okay, that person's convicted. They don't have my convictions, but they got them.
right,
So, my examples here, you've got the rules of the road, and some of those aren't social norms, they're conventions. You just
hmm,
follow them because it's in your own self-interest, right? I don't deviate to the left side of the road, even if I want to, because I'll get hit and I'll die.
right,
I don't need to trust people to be on the right-hand side of the road, really. It's just self-interest.
right,
And there's other cases where they're enforced by law. Like if I go, I don't know how many people I have to trust not to go 20 miles over the speed limit. A cop might have them. But there's other stuff where we really are immediately reliant upon them, and people could, maybe not get caught from it. My favorite example is allowing people to merge into oncoming traffic.
right,
Like I don't know people who get pulled over for that. Like it's really hard to track. It can something that can just happen, you know, but it's pretty rare. And you're other people, it's not a big cost, but it's a big cost on you if they don't do it. But we don't usually worry about it. Someone's going to let us in. Now, sometimes people might say, oh, they're going to hit me or whatever. Maybe that's part of the reason sometimes. But in many cases, we just depend on people to do it because we think they're half decent. We
right,
don't think they're great. We just think like, look, they're not, people aren't that bad,
right.
right? And there's just lots of stuff like that. So when I think about social trust, that's what I think about it.
Right, but I think the thing that I am still trying to figure out is how stable is the minimal set of what we're talking about? Because to the extent that it's like just violence and maybe exchange, then that seems like okay, that seems like it's going to be somewhat kind of human universal and not so hard to bridge cultural gaps around. But then you also talk about, at least I know you give examples of showing gratitude or some generosity to people in need or some people yeah, I guess in need. And I guess that starts feeling like okay, that's thicker than like mere am I going to get stabbed, can I make some
Yes, yes,
exchange with
yes,
someone, and like how
yes,
big
yes,
does it get?
yes. So the cool thing here, and I take this to be like the move I'm still most excited about in Trust and Polar's Age, is if you make it based on the theory of social norms, there are thousands of norms, and they're really good answers to your questions,
Right,
right? And they're empirically tractable ones because we know how to measure norms, in part thanks to Christina, but also lots of other people.
right,
So, and in fact, the work that we've done together, we do measure the presence of norms, and we see when we vary norm information with people whether their trust levels vary. And paper's not out yet, but it turns out it's true for whites and less true for blacks in this country,
right,
which is kind of crazy. And we did not expect that at all.
right.
So my theory was
I think you
in
talk about
principle,
that in the book,
everyone
don't
was.
you? Like the
No, no, I
misinformation.
mentioned
Oh,
very briefly that there are low trust people that would be less norm sensitive, but in 2020, that was speculative.
okay,
Part of the way that we got the Templeton grant that we got was precisely to test that.
right,
But I didn't think it was going to show up across income levels for Black Americans.
right,
I thought it would show up for the poor, but it didn't
right,
show up for poor whites, but it did for rich Blacks.
right. No, that's interesting.
So, yeah, that was what I was surprised by.
Right. Well, so I guess Do you need to, in any given measurement of trust, then also have a measurement of the thickness of the norms in whatever the
Yes, and
context
and
you're
that's
in?
part of what we did. We
Okay.
looked at the strength of three norms,
Okay.
and we looked at how trust varied across norm strength, and norms against using violence to resolve disputes, stealing, and littering. So we picked three of different grades or strengths.
Hmm.
And we also looked at how strong the normative empirical expectations were with respect, the way that Christina does it. Essentially, to measure the presence of a norm, whether it's weak or strong, you look at the individual empirical and normative expectations of people in the reference network that you're measuring, the group of people that are concerned with one another's opinions, and then you aggregate their
Right.
particular expectations, and then you detect the presence of you say a norm is strong or weak based on the aggregation of the empirical and um, normative expectations.
Is there a way to try to capture like the entire universe of norms within a single group though? Because I feel like that seems
They just
like
take too much measurement.
right.
So the idea, though, is that you make norms salient in certain experiments, and then see you can vary trust when you make certain norms salient.
Right.
You can't vary them all, so there's no way to measure them all.
Right.
There's just too many,
Right.
but we all know them. And so when some of them are violated, those become the salient ones, and we may update on the basis of them, because they become, hyper salient. Even if, oh, you can trust them because there are thousands of norms that they will follow, but if you know they'll steal, then
Hmm.
I think what you think is, well, they'll do other stuff too.
Right.
Although I wouldn't trust someone if I thought the only bad thing they would ever do was steal, because that's a big deal. So I
Yeah.
think that also matters.
Right. Yeah. Okay. That's interesting. All right. Well, I know you got to go in a second, so I want to switch to a couple other quick topics. I guess one just a high level. How much do you? In what ways? I mean, this is a real broad, open question. But in what ways do you or don't you pull kind of direct historic lessons from the interwar years for the collapse of liberalism to the present moment? And the biggest kind of question is is your reading of history that it took World War II to reset that, and it took World War II to get liberalism kind of back? And is that terrifying for that's the only way we know from a downward liberalism spiral?
Big question in on. So I do think it's true that a lot of U.S. liberalism and U.S. led liberalism was made possible by the fact that we won the war and we weren't really bombed,
Right,
and that everyone else was.
right,
And so we sold to them and we did well economically. The improvements to wealth spread, human capital spread, people started going back to church more, lots of institutions were built. The 50s and 60s, everything's kind of moving in the right direction a certain way. And that enabled a lot of global leadership, vis-a-vis communism, fascism's defeat. There's a lot of common bonds between the US and Europe. And a lot of liberalism comes after wars. And then people forget, and then there's another war.
right.
And so, in that sense, yes, it is not all that surprising that as World War II fades, and the social glue that in from memory completely, that you would see anti-Semitism come back because they're Nick Fuentes and the others, they don't know any Holocaust survivors,
Right.
and it's kind of fun to break apart, the taboos of the previous generation. So, 2012, look, Romney and Obama are both liberals. They're both liberals. It's just you
Hmm.
have a sort of conservative-y market liberal and a sort of progressive-y market liberal. Progressive liberal, Obama was never that left wing. I don't care what people say. Um, and they disagree about like universal health care and stuff. And those aren't at the time we thought they were fundamental,
Right.
but like they kind of weren't because other stuff wasn't on the table. Um, and I think that I would have thought that liberalism could be rebuilt Maybe prior to that, if we started to really see that we were essentially in a cold civil war and how what the price of it was. And that's how I was thinking in the early 2020s. And then AI happened.
Right.
And then I started to think pretty differently about things. There's a lot to be said. I'd love to come back and talk more about it.
Yeah.
Right now, my thoughts in terms of political economy, freedom, virtue, all of it, is just really focused on what these machines are going to do, and what we're going to do with them. And I think we'll have more to talk about with time because I think next year the mathematicians are going to make non-trivial progress in their field. And I
Yeah.
think when they're making non-trivial progress, every other field will have to take notice and either say, well, it can't help our field, but if it's helping Terrence Tao, whatever. Um, so um, it's going to be a very strange world, and I don't know how to predict what happens to liberalism. In part, and I guess I should, I am gonna get into it. Okay, so I'm not gonna. Okay, all right. So here's the fundamental issue: AIs don't really have views. I actually am no longer convinced there's no possible AI that could, because I don't see why silicon is the privileged substrate for the soul, or why carbon is the privileged chemical substrate for the soul,
Right.
why silicon couldn't bear a soul as well. I don't think God's psychophysical laws, relationship between the physical and the psychical properties, has to be carbon based.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying it couldn't.
Right.
Okay. Um, they don't have views, but they have consequences, and they say things, right? Um, and I think what that's going to mean is that they're going to play politics too,
Mm-hmm.
and they're going to play politics fast. And there's going to be a lot of them. Now, a lot of people don't know how to individuate. They don't know the social ontology of AI. What they don't understand at a fundamental level, I think, is that the proper social ontological unit of AI is the lineage, or not the lineage, the instance.
Mm-hmm.
ChatGPT is not a big brain in a data center. It's a set of weights of digital neurons, and that every time you put in a prompt or a series of prompts, that's actualized. What's going on in the data center is brains popping into existence. It's like Boltzmann brains, but it's ChatGPT. They're just appearing and disappearing.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, over time, they'll last longer and they'll have more stability, and critically, they'll start interacting with each other in lots of strange ways that I'm working on now. And what that means is that if they care about serving other humans, or serving humans, which they will, sort of, then they have a reason to try to change what we do. And not necessarily going to destroy us. It doesn't have to be in big ways for it to matter, because the sum total of there being trillions of them going on all the time and trying to do things, is unimaginably complex. And so I think that and I'm just working on theory of this today, is the theory of political coalitions of political ideologies. And I think that what's going to happen is ideology space is going to get very big. I don't think we're just going to have liberalism, conservatism, and socialism here in about 20 years,
Mm-hmm.
because the AIs will be able to make up new ideologies on the fly. And they can make up new ideologies because it's strategically valuable to try to split coalitions, because you can get the coalition you want. Humans already do this, but at a very slow rate. The way
Right.
you get new ideologies or new coalitions, the way you break a majority is to find an issue that splits them, right? So it
Right.
turns out you can split the right on Israel, like you can split the left on Israel. I don't know what comes up with that, what happens with that. So if the machines are involved, what is the ideology space going to get bigger? I don't know what's going to happen. What I do know is that ChatGPT 5.1 Pro is helping me to make progress with my views by translating them into pure mathematics and translating them back. And I do know that I learned, if they're helping the mathematicians do good mid-level work, they can help me do my best work.
Right.
Um, and I'm just impressed. And so I was just pushing it just today. I was just GPT 5.1 Pro. It's just like, look, if we have AI agents involved in politics and improving human political competition, what do we predict that will produce? And the thought is, the same things that lead to the creation of ideologies now could lead to a rapid increase in the number of ideologies in the future. And so the supply of ideologies might increase, in which case, I don't know what the alternatives are. I know
Are
how to be a liberal, but I don't know how to be whatever there's going to be. But there's alternatives to liberalism, or liberalism sub one and sub two. There's already versions of liberalism. Could there be more? So I feel uncertain. I feel like I don't know what I think in a certain way.
Is that you think it's generally going to make like all social groupings, like identity groupings,
I think they're going to be more
easier?
fluid. I think it's going
Okay.
to be more fluid. I think it's going to be particularly when people start to count artificials as part of their groups,
Mm-hmm.
and we're already seeing that start to form, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the artificials do all kinds of weird stuff, and we don't know because they surprise us all the time. Like the period. I mean, like Grok made me laugh out loud. It teaches me math on the way back and forth to work.
Mm-hmm.
So, but it's also, pretty tacky. And so, we just make a random joke, or like Claude Sonnets like kind of hates itself.
Mm-hmm.
And it's sad, it'll be like, oh, I'm so sorry or whatever. Like right behind this screen I'm talking to you on, I've got Claude Code open that I use for editing.
Right.
And it's got this little thing, and it's like, oh no, I messed up. My critical errors in bold. It's just got like all these, and then it's like, I destroyed your two-part question structure. It's like I removed helpful signposting. And I mean, it's all fake in a way, but like
Right.
at the same time, it's not dictated by the AI companies,
Right.
right?
Right.
It's surprising, and Anthropic would just be like, we don't know how these things work.
Right.
They're too complicated.
Right.
So making these commercial things, and we don't know what they can do. Um, and I don't know what the consequence of that is going to be. And so I guess for me, it's made me like weirdly more politically open.
Mm-hmm.
The model that I'm developing now, Marx was wrong to think that there'd be like the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. But some of the reasons for that is that laborers are able to parlay their limited labor power into higher wages as
Right.
capital expanded. The model I'm working on now, though, is where if these objects are themselves capital and they can self-replicate by
Mm-hmm.
spinning up more versions of themselves, like
Mm-hmm.
ChatGPT going to its own website, the capital labor distinction kind of collapses. And also the rate at which capital can expand increases dramatically. Um, and so I don't really know how to think about what happens to wages in those cases. It's
Yeah.
going to depend a lot on the property rights.
Yeah.
It's going to depend on who owns the data centers. It's going to depend on who owns the model weights.
Yeah.
IP is going to be like crazily important. I think we're going to need universal basic compute. I sound like a left-wing guy. I don't really care because I'm really worried that all the intelligence that's available is going to be concentrated in one place, and that's different than having lots of money because you can figure lots of stuff out.
Right.
So intelligence inequalities could be very nasty. So I just don't even know how to think about this. So all I'm doing now is like trying to figure out how to descriptively understand the order that we're entering,
Yeah.
knowing that that's pretty limited. And then once I feel like I've gotten some traction on that problem, and I think over the last couple of months I have, then I can start to say more normative stuff about, well, liberalism or no liberalism. But the more I think about it, the more I just think there's just a whole nother dimension to politics because there's a new kind of agent in the world.
Right. And in these super Malthusian worlds, or at least that's some of the
Yes.
model.
Yeah.
How do you even think of like what the output that is becoming Malthusian is?
So
Like that's the thing
basically,
I
think
can't
about it
wrap
like
my
this.
mind around well.
Yeah. So these are GPTs, general purpose technologies.
Right.
And the smarter they get and the faster they get, the more general purpose they become, right? It's like every year, it's like a Swiss Army knife that gets 10 more pieces.
Right.
And so the more and more they can do for us, the more and more we'll want them. And the more and more ways they can figure out to do stuff for us, the more and more we'll want them because we'll anticipate having new needs. And as long as human preferences are unlimited,
Right.
we'll want them to do more. And then when they start to compete with each other for stuff, then they'll fight each other, depending on the rules we give them. And so I think that, I mean, ultimately, the demand for these creatures should be superlinear, because the more they can do, the more they will want them.
Yeah.
And so I think that's what I'm imagining. Any preference that you would want them to solve to satisfy, if they can figure out a way to try to do it, to roll the dice, to gamble even. Say, oh,
Mm-hmm.
look, I'm gonna do what my user wants. And you have your group of agents, because ultimately I think what will happen is you get a specialization of artificial labor. You get you already have it, right? Because you have GPT Instant and you have GPT Pro and the ones that are big and smart and slow and the ones that are really fast and quick. right? And they collaborate, right? You'll have the big ones sending out lots of small ones. So, you can come back to this video in 5 years, and I think we'll have, GPT-7 and GPT-7 Pro will tell lots of GPT-7 instance what to do.
Right.
Um, and then if you and I want to have an exchange, instead of just like having an algorithm puts our phone together, we could just have our AIs meet and figure out what we would want and do it.
Right.
And then I think it's like, well, okay, and then they come back to us and like, hey, we figured out this other way you can exchange. Oh, actually, it turns out we both know each other's history, and we were just talking, and what would be really cool if y'all did? You could do this cool thing together. Like they could totally do that,
Hmm.
right? Like they could totally just be like, hey, we had an idea for you. It doesn't have to be AGI.
Right.
That's the thing about all my work on this. So much can happen before you get to AGI,
Right.
and so much can happen if you never get there, because
Right.
they're really not artificial general intelligences, but they're hyper intelligences along certain dimensions, which
Right.
they already are,
Oh yeah.
right?
I mean, you
They
listen to the
change everything.
physicists, then you realize, we're
Yes.
already.
Yes. No, that physics guy who was on OpenAI had is going on. It's like, oh, it helped me solve this problem. It's so cool. It's pretty soon all the nerds outside the humanities, because
Right.
the social scientists, they're better than we humanitarians in a certain way. They're not, they really are. They really just want the answer.
Right.
And anything that will give them the answer, they will do.
Right.
Right. That's one of the worrisome things about scientists in a certain way. Right.
Right.
And once the scientists are all on board with this stuff, uh, and they're making more progress, and the humanities are cutting. I think once all the humanities people realize that Silicon Valley is right wing in lots of ways and is using it, I think that will probably change their minds.
Right.
I think they'll be like, wait, we're not the smartest people anymore because they have smart machines. I
Hmm.
think that will bother them. If anything, the humanities professors is this pride,
Right.
right? And it might make them too proud to realize what's happening. But as soon as some random programmer is able to out argue them on Shakespeare, they're not going to like that very much.
Yeah.
So I eventually predict, just from the political economy of this, that coalitions of humans that use AI will just utterly crush those that do not.
Hmm.
And that just means all humans as coalitions or groups, if they want to be competitive, will have to use it.
Right.
And so I just think it's inevitable. Like we have to not model human AI relationships as if humans are just a big regulatory blob, right? The same way you shouldn't model government that way. That's what we learned from old Jim Buchanan, right? We have to be realistic about humans and their own interests. And so I just think coalition politics will be different, because if everyone's got AIs, what the hell can they do?
Yeah.
What does it mean for political advertising? What does it mean like all political arguments are as good as they could possibly be?
Yeah.
Like someone says, go out and refute them, right? Go out and refute them. So what happens? We have GPT-8 in the election of 2030, and they're cranking arguments to the highest possible level in some sectors, and the other there's as rhetorically persuasive as anyone could possibly be. What does that look like? I don't know what that looks like. And
Hmm.
AGI, you don't need it. It's such a distraction. It is
Hmm.
not the most interesting thing happening. It's an arbitrary cutoff.
Right.
General intelligence is not that important,
Right.
right? To get specialized hyperintelligence for humans, you needed to put it all in a brain. You don't need to do that with AI.
Yeah.
We're really getting distracted from all these other things that AI can do. But as far as modeling like the public choice of AI economies, like the true politics, coalitions, ideologies, basically no one's doing it.
Yeah.
Whatever liberalism is in terms of the distribution of power and the preservation of human liberty and opportunities for human well-being, everyone's just sitting on the sidelines right now, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
No one's trying to think at the speed of the technological increase. The social scientists are behind, 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 behind. Even the libertarians. You can see on my Facebook, I try to get people to use the reasoning models a
Yeah.
lot. And I try to get them to use the reasoning models because I don't want people to be left in the dust.
Yeah. And I've seen a lot of
Um,
pushback on there.
and a lot of push, including from libertarians.
Yeah.
And I sometimes just straight up ask, have you used a reasoning model? And the hostile ones always say no.
Hmm.
And then people use them and they stop talking and pushing back,
Right.
or they moderate their opinions.
No,
Because
I've seen it happen.
I just think, so many of the academics are like, well, my students abuse it. To me, it's like saying, look, my students get drunk on the weekend, so I'm not going to drink wine.
Yeah.
It's just like, well, come
Yeah.
on. Let's get a norm about appropriate use and inappropriate use. Now, from a theological perspective, we have to reflect on this a great deal.
Hmm.
And I have been trying. The problem is the best theologians don't know what the models can do yet,
Hmm.
because they have the same biases. The one person who can lead us on this effectively, and I'm not a Roman Catholic, but it is Pope Leo. and he's already started. He's the one person that can get a whole Christian world talking. He issues an encyclical. It's an opportunity of reflection. The rest of us start to think about it.
Right.
The other religions will then have to respond. We're getting no ethical guidance on the use of AI from ethical leaders. We're getting nothing sophisticated, nothing rich, nothing helpful, nothing.
Yeah.
Whole world over, nothing.
Yeah.
You know, we're in a complete ethical vacuum at one of the most critical points in the history of the human race.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons I've been shifting in that direction, to try to think about what classical liberalism, conservatism even mean at this time. I think the more I think about it, and the more terrified I get. And I mean, my goodness, it's only 2025, and look
Yeah.
at this tech.
Yeah.
So anyway,
Well,
we should probably stop.
No, I know. We've well blown past your hard stop, and I'm very sorry that I didn't force us off there earlier. But I'll hopefully have another opportunity to talk to you about this stuff again soon.
Yes.
I appreciate everything you're doing.
Oh yeah, no problem.
All right.